Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazell, and this is Dev Dive, a show where I get a chance to talk to interesting video game developers about their games, their creative spirit, their voices. And today, I have special guest Remy Siu on here to talk about his work on 1000xRESIST, a game that I would say is, in many people's minds, one of the most unique and enigmatic games of 2024. And we're going to dive into the twisted mind that created it today. But Remy, thank you very much for joining me. I just sent you a blue sky message and you're like, yeah, I'll do it. So we're here just on a whim, basically. And I want you to sort of introduce yourself to set the groundwork. Introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your studio, Sunset Visitor, and a brief introduction about 1000xRESIST. Make sure that people are kind of on the same page here before we get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, my name is Remy Siu. I'm the creative director at Sunset Visitor Studios, and then also on our first game, 1000xRESIST. The studio is it was founded during the pandemic, and many of us are experimental performing artists who shifted into video games, largely because we couldn't work or practice during the pandemic. And 1000xRESIST is the game that kind of came out of that first process. The way that I've been talking about it recently or pitching it is that it's a game where a not so put together teenage girl spawns a society of clones, and you see the fallout of that, and she becomes one of the most important people in the world, I suppose. Yeah.
One of the only people in the world.
One of the only people in the world, yes. Yeah. And for gamers, I guess it's more of like a narrative adventure type of game. So really inspired by point and clicks and things like Firewatch and Kentucky Route Zero. So, yeah.
You're touching on all the right notes for me.
Yeah.
I played through the game over the course of the last couple weeks, and I really enjoyed it. I'm excited to get into the story and the development process and stuff, but I do want to make it clear up front here. I'll ask a few questions that are specifically not spoilers. We're not going to get into any of the things that happen later on in the game that I think are important for people to experience on their own for the first time, for the themes and the characters and the pacing and the writing to really hit them in the way it should. But I also do want to transition maybe halfway through and be like, all right, the shackles are off. The weight has been lifted. We can talk about everything. So I will make sure that's clear when we get to that point. But I do want to start kind of with you and your history with games, because as you mentioned, this is your first project, game design-wise, that you've worked on. But I'm curious where your personal experience with games comes from. Games that you loved as a child, maybe some games that you were playing. I guess you mentioned Firewatch and Kentucky Route Zero, but maybe games that you were playing leading up to the pandemic that maybe inspired you to want to be a game designer. And also, did you want to be a game designer as a child? Explore that sort of childhood fascination with games.
I did want to be a game designer as a child, but I was born in the 90s. Yeah. And so back then, you really couldn't. I can't believe I'm talking about the 90s back then.
30 years ago.
Yep.
That's you got to start that cutoff of where you can talk about the good old days. That 30 years sounds about right.
Yeah, it's true. I facepalm. So the 90s, for those who don't know, you couldn't just make games back then, the random person could not make a game. And especially a kid could not make a game. That's all changed, obviously. Kids make games now. Kids apparently make money making games also. My first console was a PlayStation, and that really got me into games. My mind was blown by Final Fantasy VII, the original one. I was very young when I played it. It left a huge impression on me. So I wanted to make games. There's no path for that at that time. So I guess I got interested in the arts in general. Not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but it's just more that I was okay, what can I make? Or I can try drawing some stuff. I could try writing things. I could try whatever. But I guess the writing aspect was the thing that stuck with me at the time, because I was really interested in narrative story games, right? Final Fantasy VII kind of really being one of those. And then I also grew up playing point and click adventures like Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis and Monkey Island, The Dig, all of them. To answer your question very specifically, yes, it was a desire of mine since I was young, but then I went to go study the arts later on. So it was kind of a pretty long round trip over to doing it, because it's actually not been that long since, the tools for making indie games were as available as they are today. It seems like an eternity inside the indie industry, but from like a more zoomed out perspective, it's like been a small blip,
Yeah.
right?
Well, of course, the games industry is so young that any given decade or 5 years, major changes happen. And so when you even think
Yeah.
about 10 years ago, indie games being available on, the HD consoles at the time, this was a new burgeoning market that's where you get like the now iconic indie games. And so like, especially the indie games as we know them today, like this is a maybe 15-year-old thing at max in the way we consider it now.
Yeah, like you can go back. We were talking about this at the studio the other day. It's like, oh, you could go back maybe to like Owl's Story. You could go back to Bastion and things like that, or Xbox Arcade.
hmm Meat Boy, Limbo, Fez.
Yep, yep, yep. That actually wasn't that long
No,
ago.
absolutely not.
It really was not that long ago.
No, but I do think that the way that things have evolved so quickly is really fascinating to study. I think that you and your team are reaching it at an interesting point where when you started it, obviously greatly impacted the way that you designed your games. But I also do think it's important to give you a accidental commendation, I guess, of finding your way into being a game designer later on in your career after you had done other elements of artistic expression through writing and through, you mentioned, drawing and uh, theatrical exhibition and things, because I do think that is what makes 1000xRESIST and your work different from other people. It's always good to have voices and people with different experiences that can draw from other sources of artistic inspiration rather than I've just been a game designer my entire history. It gives you a unique
Totally.
flavor. And I'm curious, with this being your first video game project, how did you manage the scope of 1000xRESIST? This is the first one you've worked on. What kind of research and planning went into making sure that you didn't just reach too far beyond your team's abilities?
Just before I answer that question, I'm gonna back up and say, even though I drew as a kid, I'm shit at it, and so like, that's why we have an artist on our team. Yeah. So for scope, I mean, I think very early on when I was doing the prototype, I was doing it by myself. I started it by myself, like very deep pandemic, like 1 month into the pandemic, and at that point, the scope was very real, or like trying to scope it was very real because like I knew that I couldn't do many things, like for example, draw it.
Sure.
And that was a decision, or quite early on, that was like, okay, this is going to be a narrative game. This is going to be very narrative focused and driven. And from previous experience working in the arts, one of the approaches I always like to take when I start a project is like, okay, let me pick a path and really lean into that path as hard as I can and try to like rip out anything that doesn't make sense in that regard. And much of that, like for example, the game has no combat, the game has no inventory, the game has no not that many puzzles. You don't move a box to go stand on it and climb up something else, for example. So all of those things were actively like, yeah, we're not going to do those. And if we don't do those, how does that make space for the narrative to be presented? Also, what types of ways that can we present that narrative that we've yet to discover because we don't do any of those things? Of course, it turned out to be incredibly hard. But speaking on the scope thing, that's a great question to be asked, because like one of the very early on discussions of it's like, yes, we want to be able to do a narrative that has quite a long horizontal length,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
One that spans a lot of time, one that has lots of characters. We're going to try to do that at an indie scale, and we're going to try and engage with and counter challenges at our specific size as a team.
Yeah. What was the total team size for Sunset Visitor during the project?
During the project, it was like 4 full-time people, 2 part-time. The composers, who were on and off, they work in a very different cycle, and someone was helping us with social media closer to like the middle and the end of the project. But like the main development team, largely at any given time, I think there was only about like 3 people max ever touching Unity, for example. Yeah, so a relatively small team. Obviously you can't complete on a graphical fidelity level because like AAA has that kind of cornered, right? And they have the resources for that. We knew this was our first game, so like, and we were making a 3D game, and so we knew that it was probably not advantageous for us to take on other types of mechanics that were those very specific ones that may not have interested us as well, And so we were just like double down on like, okay, the real thing about this game is that it's going to try and attempt to tell a density of story on a horizontal, scale that often games don't do. Like maybe JRPGs do it, but like I think originally earlier on I was like, yeah, maybe we can fit more density of story in this game than than a 100-hour JRPG, because in a 100-hour JRPG, like 80 hours of it or like 95 hours of it are something else.
Yeah. Combat, walking around the open world, side
Yeah,
quests.
yeah, 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 yeah.
It's funny that you mention this wrangling of the scope because when you play 1000 xRESIST, I don't think it feels like a game with like a lot of barriers for its scope. It is, I mean, it took me almost 10 hours to play through, which is pretty substantial for a narrative game that is narrative focused the entire time
Yeah,
through. Of
right.
course, that's a lot of voice acting, that's a lot of writing, that's a lot of dialogue choices that you have to plan out. But also, it is, as you mentioned, very dense. There isn't the downtime that you get in a lot of the games that might actually end up padding out their runtime to something like even 10 or 12 hours. And for a small team, that is really, really impressive the way that you were ambitious within your team size. I mean, this is one of the longer, more dense games that I've played that came from such a small team.
The padding part is interesting because like, and you can say that like in other games, they have more tools in which to pace the game. And for us in the end, the only way to pace the game was to do that on a conversation level or from an environment level. And there's a lot of things that we couldn't do. For example, like in many games, I bring that box, you move a box to climb on the box to like, climb on a ledge. That's like a great pacing tool, right? It changes your brain state as you're playing for that. But when you don't have that, it's like, okay, well, do you have, what do you fill that with?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
that was a challenge.
Yeah. And to the point of this being a small team from a team of largely first time developers or all first time developers.
Well, our programmer is from a AAA
Oh,
background,
okay.
so he has the most experience in making games. Yeah, the rest of us do not have any games
Okay.
experience.
Yeah. So again, mostly first time developers. I am curious how you ended up funding this project, what avenues you went through to receive enough money to fund a team of this size for that many years. And how did you sort of pitch this to people to get money to make it?
That's a great question. Also, I see the angle of this podcast now. It's good. We funded it largely through the Canada Media Fund. For people who don't know what that is, it's a funder, and it also does linear media as well. So it also funds film and independent film. If we're really going to get into the details here, it's like, we have um, two larger funding bodies in Canada. One is Canada Council for the Arts, which is on a federal level, and that's a huge funding body for the arts in Canada, mostly for independent arts, right? So independent, kind of like of all disciplines, non-commercial specifically. And Canada Media Fund is kind of straddles the line of that, where obviously they are looking for specific artistic expressions, they're looking for artistic voices, they want to fund things that haven't been made or specifically cannot be made in more market-driven environments. So much of our funding did come from Canada Media Fund, and then also funding from our publisher, Fellow Traveler. So it was a mix of that kind of got the game out the door.
Yeah. Do you remember what those early conversations were like, especially with the publisher, Fellow Traveler, when you were pitching this unique project from a very unique group of people?
The scout at the time, Felix Kramer, credit is given to them and to Fellow Traveler in the sense that they were like, oh, this is really weird. I mean, to a certain extent, this is retroactively how they told us about it, because like obviously we were on the other end of this while we were talking, but there was like, oh, what is this? Like, this is wild. What is the what's going on?
Yeah.
And they were kind of interested in jumping in on that kind of thing, which we were very lucky to discover in games, because that is not always the case.
Yeah, of
right?
course.
And the prototype was weird. The prototype was like way weirder than the final game, I think, actually. Yeah, so like those discussions that we were talking to them specifically just about the story, but like the early vision of it was that, yeah, it's going to have the content of essentially a season's worth of television, right? In about 10 hours. And they helped us actually apply to the Canada Media
Oh,
Fund,
nice. Okay.
which was I think one of the reasons why the application was successful at the time.
That's a sign of a really good publisher when they can help you along in that process as well.
The biggest part was that, if people are listening to this and they're familiar with applying for different types of funding, usually if you can attach a publisher to a project, it helped the funder is a little happier about that, right? So
Yeah, makes sense. And I've heard actually a little bit about the Canada Media Fund on the show. I talked to Dylan Geddig and Sienna Blumstengel from Red Nexus Games, who made Peglin, and part of their game,
yeah.
a lot of their game, I think, was also funded by that. So you can see Peglin to 1000 Times Resist. Those games don't share any DNA, but the Canada Media Fund is putting a lot of effort into a lot of different kinds of avenues.
Oh, totally. And I think you look at the Canadian game development scene, especially on indie level, it's quite rich in its diversity. There's so many types of games being made on an indie level in Canada. I think the density of indie games coming out of Canada is pretty intense. Like last year, the year before last year, I guess we're in January now. Venba is a Canadian game.
Love that game.
And Balatro is a Canadian game. 1000xRESIST is a Canadian game. Goodbye Volcano High is a Canadian game. There's just quite a rich tapestry of games coming out of Canada. And I think, in many ways, not all of them were Canada Media funded, but Canada does have some funding for these projects, and that's why many of them can exist. That being said, the double-edged sword of all this funding is it's a crushing amount of paperwork.
Of course,
so,
of course.
Yeah, I'm just saying this for people listening to it if they're thinking about it. It's a really crushing amount of you pay for it one way or another, right? With funding.
I do actually want to circle back to something you mentioned during answering this question about funding, which is the prototype that you made for 1000 Times Resist. You said it was even weirder than the final project ended up being. Is there any key ways that it was different from the final project that people might find interesting?
Oh yeah, so the secretary in the prototype only spoke with Calmoji.
Yeah, that is weirder. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And they were often very strange Calmoji. Secretary was much weirder an entity. In the end, because we knew the game was voiced, and how are we gonna voice these Calmojis, right? We had thought of some ways, but maybe it's not a good idea. Or we really had to commit, but our kind of way of kind of replacing that was let's hire a 12-year-old child to voice Secretary.
Well, that was actually one of the first things I remember noticing about the game is that Secretary is voiced by a child for a lot of the game, and
yes,
I kept wondering as I was listening, is this an actual child? Is it someone doing a sort of childlike voice?
It was an actual child.
Yeah. Well, they do a great job, and actually, this perfectly leads me to my
Yes.
next question: is what was the voice actor casting process like for this game? You have quite a bit of characters, and they all have a lot of dialogue, and you're doing this during lockdown. So, talk a little bit about the process of choosing these actors for these crazy roles.
Many of them actually we knew from our community. So one of the desires of the project was to showcase a lot of the local performing arts talent in Vancouver. There's a wide range of their backgrounds. So some of them are local theater performers. Some of them have been our mentors when we were younger. For example, Maiko Yamamoto, who plays Principal, was one of our mentors as we were kind of coming up in the art scene in Vancouver. And then some of them were dancers, and then some of them were untrained, but the idea was we were casting from our community. I think the earliest call, everybody we don't know send their voice tapes, and everybody we do know, we know what you sound. Yeah, we know, we know you. So and so we all sat around a digital board in which we were just trying to cast these sisters. And one thing that should be noted is that we casted before we started writing, which is
okay.
not a relatively normal thing to do, I understand. But I desired that the writers and myself knew what these people sounded like
Okay.
before we started writing for them.
Match their personality and tone to the writing.
Yeah, their personality and tone. And then we also recorded as we were making the game, so not all just at the end. And so their performances as we were writing and making the game and recording the game influenced how we would write dialogue for them as well in the future. So that was a cool thing. It's kind of like, we wanted to set it up a little bit like a TV show in the sense that, there was some serialness to it. So that as writers, as we were going, we would be learning more and more about the performers, as opposed to the performers coming in and all the text being locked later on.
One thing that I find really fascinating about the casting that you did for this game and the cast of characters, which is quite vast, I would say there are at least 20 plus like sizable characters in this game, is that most of them narratively are clones. They're biologically identical people. As you mentioned up at the top, the narrative follows mostly a young girl named Iris, who then is the only survivor of an apocalypse, and then all the other characters are clones of her. And one thing I found interesting is that in my mind, that would mean that they would all sound the same. And do you remember when that process of choosing the narrative to be about clones and then, obviously the voice casting process, you're like, well, you can make some sort of, I guess, in-world narrative break where it's like, they're voiced by different people, even though technically, like, I guess, their vocal cords would technically be mostly the same. I just found that an interesting juxtaposition that does help differentiate the characters. Of course, they all look different as well, but
I think that we thought that immediately because we were like, oh, we want to include as many people that we know
of course,
as possible.
Yeah.
And then also like, yeah, it would be a real challenge for one person to like voice. I think there is at least 45 characters last I checked, like that are, have lines, if not more. And so it's like, I think that would have been really challenging for even like someone who's incredibly gifted, right?
Yeah, of course.
Because even if you look on something like The Simpsons, those actors are gifted. Even they don't voice like 40, 20 people.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, God, yeah.
It's already a miracle they can voice like 7 different characters.
Yeah, on a show that's been going for 40 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this being the first time that you managed a project like this, your first time designing a game, I'm curious if there's any mistakes that you made in the design process that you might be able to learn from for your next project. Any moments you're like, oh crap, like I didn't realize that, or that you kind of learn on the fly while designing your first game. Anything that you sort of learned through this process?
Yeah, I mean, like, what's interesting about it is because, this is definitely the first game that I've made, but kind of in the arts, there's around 10 years of making our own projects and producing them and putting them together and for stage and for film and for whatnot. But, yeah, games are a whole new different dimension in which things are made. And in my opinion, I think the hardest as far as in my experience, because we were moving so quickly in development with content. I mean, we were like writing and we were like making new levels and we were like trying to stick to a rhythm on making the chapters. One of the things that kind of got out of hand or that we kind of lost track of was we accrued what I would say is a graphical debt, which kind of came to a head when we had to port to the Nintendo Switch, right? So, because obviously the Nintendo Switch was much like way less powerful than the PCs that we were making the game on. And so while we were like had okay performance on something like the Steam Deck, the Nintendo Switch performance I think was like 1 frame per second.
Oh my God.
Or like less,
Oh, no.
like it was like not working essentially.
You can't sell that.
Yeah, and so we didn't know what we didn't know about that stuff. Of course, we learned, and that was actually, a very challenging experience, but at the same time quite rewarding in that now we have a lot of that knowledge. And, even thinking about future projects, one of the first things that we are thinking about is like, okay, well, how can we avoid accruing that kind of graphical debt? Now that's just a part of making a game that we have a better sense of how to track and when that might become important. Early on in production, when you're making things, you don't want to over optimize too early, right? Because that doesn't make any sense. You're going to end up changing it. And then just getting a sense of like the flow of those things in a game, the cycle of a game production of just like, yeah, when do you lock in with quote unquote the quality version of it, or when do you polish it? Because if you start polishing it too early, that's probably not a good idea. You'll end up kind of throwing that work maybe away later. But sometimes you do need to polish it. That's the tricky thing about games is that what is the right level of fidelity? And I don't mean just graphical fidelity.
just general polish on all of them elements of the game.
Yeah, or just general, like close to final product. What is the right degree of that at the right time? Right, is constantly the question. So in terms of what we learned, so many things. Because I have a music composition background, composers have different relationships with temp music, right? Some really don't like temp music because it colors the way in which they can interpret the scene. They want to be able to have a chance to interpret the scene first, but temp music kind of takes that away. For like at least a year into development, there was zero music in the game because I was trying to be sensitive to that. I was like, I'm not putting any music in the game until composers can kind of play through it. And the composers came back and they're like, it's okay. In fact, it would be helpful because sometimes in a scene in this game, especially, you're just like, what is going on? Like, what are you thinking here? Like, you got to give me some direction. And especially if you have a good relationship with your composer, and I'm speaking specifically to people who may be listening that want to work with composers or work with composers. If they're just like, yeah, that would be helpful and fine to have temp music, you could ask them, like, what is your relationship with temp music, and is it okay if I use some? In that case, it does help along with playtesting and other things like this. I think a couple of our first playtests is like zero sound in it, right? And it's tough.
Yeah, really changes the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fascinating that you've learned so much from your first project. And as I mentioned, that sets you up very nicely for future game projects. But I think a lot of people, knowing your history of your artistic history of coming from theater and other arts to game development, would be tempted to ask, what did you take from theater that you then applied to your game? But I am not your ordinary.
Okay.
I'm not your ordinary interviewer.
I was just sitting up getting ready to answer this. Yeah.
I'm curious what you learned from game development that you might be able to apply to future composition projects, theater projects, writing projects, external to games, now that you have this experience.
That is really interesting. Okay, if I were to go back, what would I take from games? 100% I would take version control. I would version control everything. In many ways, so much of performing arts and also like even film processes, as far as I know, unless things have gotten like really more advanced than I remember, the version control is not a thing. The voiceover process that we undertook for the game, we did version control the whole audio library for that. And it took a long time for all the people on the audio side to kind of like wrap our heads around why this was cool, I guess, to do. But you're dealing with like 15,000 small audio files, right?
Yeah.
And to understand if you're changing the name of one or if you have made like all of that with version control is like, it makes it so much easier. And also it makes processing, interestingly, you can be way more ruthless, right? And so a desire to version control everything is something that I would take from video game development back to what I would used to be doing. So many of the workflows in terms of task tracking, I would try to bring back into the theater in some form or fashion.
Was there anything that maybe you learned from this expansive writing process of so many characters and so many intertwining storylines that might have like stretched your abilities that you might be able to apply retroactively?
It's interesting because it's like tough. Like a lot of what we had to adjust for coming into games from that space, the time in which you have an idea to want to do something and the time in which you can test it whether that thing is cool to do is quite far apart in games. Not always, but like when it comes to something that is maybe narratively driven and where you kind of can't tell if the scene is working if it's not like lit like it might actually be lit, for example, then it's challenging. But I'm just thinking about it now. Like I would have to like go back and make some theater work or something, and then maybe be able to more fully answer that question completely. That being said, like, version control, all those things, like in terms of the writing process, I mean, this time we did have to codify a little bit more of the way that we thought into a process than we usually do in theater, because sometimes in theater we just kind of, this is experimental theater, by the way. It's not like a scripted theater thing. It's like we just kind of figure it out, Like on that scale of writing, we've never attempted before. Like we definitely have strategies that we were taking forward and coming back, separating into different phases of writing that helps us, specifically us as the type of writers that we are, to work at scale, I guess that's something definitely I would take back with me. But that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Glad to be of service.
Yeah.
I think now is a good time to transition into spoilers. I'm going to be asking some questions about narrative and about sequences that, again, I want people to play and experience on their own before having the wind taken out of them by whatever we talk about here. So there's your out, everyone. If you have not played the game, you're, you're 30 minutes into the review, so you've done your part watching this far. But for those of you who are sticking around, I'm about to ask some hard-hitting narrative questions and things. But I am curious if there's any stories or moments during development, making the story and writing scenes and crafting these interconnected sequences that you found particularly challenging to figure out, whether that's design-wise or narratively, making a certain moment sing. You mentioned the music and the lighting. Was there any specific particular sequences that you remember like being a pain point or a sticking point of like, man, I just can't get this one particular thing to really hit the way I want it to?
Oh, yeah, there's lots. There's lots. I'm just like thinking through them right now.
Which in the Rolodex of many options should I choose today?
Yes, yes. Well, one, for example, like the chapter 4 cave memory section took many passes to get working in a way that we liked, right? One of them was kind of figuring out what you'd be actually doing in that cave and how that level was structured. That was the only time where we like play tested the text in such a big way, because much of you kind of solving the kind of somewhat simple puzzle that is presented to you in chapter 4, the cave, with the occupant, we just had to test many different times whether people were kind of getting it.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I mean, to be completely transparent, that was certainly one of the parts of the game I had the hardest time with because I didn't realize there was going to be a puzzle because up to that point,
Right.
it's just been a couple of small dialogue options, but then this is something that you need to internalize what these characters are
Yes.
saying in order to progress. And I was stuck there for a little bit because I didn't realize
Yeah.
that I needed to go somewhere else. Of course, there's light coming out of the cave, so I eventually was like, game design brain, I get this. But I kept trying to talk to is it Noah, I think, that's with you, or
Yeah.
and I'm like,
Noah's with
why is
you.
this not like? Because usually you just talk to your companion to like move on. But so I definitely understand why that would be difficult, especially how different it is compared to the first hours of the game.
Yeah. And so a lot of the writing there needed to be workshopped quite a bit, and it took us a long time to find the right voice for the occupants, I guess, in terms of writing wise. We went through multiple passes of that for sure. And I often say that the whole ending was very, very challenging.
I can imagine, yes.
It was very difficult. Anything after chapter 7 was very hard for us. Chapter 8, for example, had to be rewritten completely or rethought completely after playtests from chapter 7 had come in, and people were responding quite strongly to it in a good way, and then we were like, oh shit, like that was, it's nice, like sometimes this happens, like in these processes you like start to make something and you cannot forecast or anticipate how people may respond to it. But early playtests of chapter 7 was like people were quite affected by it.
Yeah. Any particular moments in chapter 7 that you remember people like really gravitating towards?
I think the video at the end, I think the
Oh,
fact that
sure.
it like starts to coalesce a lot of the strands and starts to make some meaning out of them, through some real suffering,
Sure.
I guess,
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
And it was also a very hard chapter to make from a technical perspective, or like just from a making perspective. So after 7, we were like, oh man, like we have to rethink what chapter 8 will be because of that, and then 8, 9, and 10 was all very difficult, and 8 was just you are trapped in a very small place, and all there is in that chapter is the sisters talking to each other. Right? This is the sense where it's like, oh my god, every line of dialogue has to mean something here or has to be important because this is what there is.
Yeah.
Right? This is it.
That's the chapter that's mostly on the train, right? You're like running back and forth.
Yeah. And part of it was like, our original desire there was that you are getting ping pong back and forth by your siblings, essentially, which is something that at least people with siblings may have experienced before.
Well, I think what is so compelling about 1000 Times Resist, and also what I assume made it so difficult to coalesce things by the end in those final chapters is that it's a very thematically varied game. There's a lot of topics that you're touching on. There's a lot of characters with different personalities that bring out different elements of the themes. And I'm curious for you, is family maybe the theme that you see this game representing most, or is there some other topic or theme or concept that you think is like the core of A Thousand Times Resist in all of the web of different ideas that it's managing?
Yeah, I mean, like I think for me, I mean, just off the top of my head right now, it's like there's a kind of like omnidirectional yearning that one has in life, perhaps, either whether that represents itself as like nostalgia or whether that represents itself as like could be anxiety or whatever, like just a general sense of these characters kind of in a time and place and perhaps wanting more, with that more being quite varied. Just how things kind of play out in time is one thing that we were really obsessed about with the game, right? Like for example, Jav's diary. I think the first appearance of Jav's diary, yeah, chapter 2 shows up in chapter 2, and then you can like basically trace the life of that object and its importance through the entire game, and that's something that we wanted for that to be able to be done. And then yes, as you say, it was quite difficult to bring to an end, because of all of the various things that we had going, right? And I think this is something that we always talk about, is that we like art that is just, pouring out of itself,
Definitely,
and that
yeah.
it doesn't try to stop that
Yeah,
process.
of course.
Sometimes I feel like, there's a degree that it's like a approach to formatting story and forming story that feels overly polite.
Sure. Yeah, it can be limiting, can feel a little less honest. Yeah, I totally understand that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and with the complexity of A Thousand Times Resist and all of the characters and different voices and perspectives that it represents, I think that you did a good job at not limiting yourself, because there were times where I'm like, I don't even really remember like who this character is or what their desires are or whatever, but like I know that you guys paid a lot of attention to it and can tell me like the backstories of all these characters. I'm like, okay, I know what's in there. And if I need to go read a wiki or watch a story explained or whatever, I know I'll be able to get it. So I like was able to like let myself go along for the ride and allow the themes and characters to hit me when I was able to receive them.
And I do think that that's like an aesthetic tension inside of the game itself, where there's a desire for the game to kind of spill outwards from like a formal and sense making place. And then there's a desire also for that the game can be, if you looked closer at it, perhaps from a canon perspective, that it all holds up. There's a desire to have both. Sometimes we would say to ourselves like, oh yeah, like we want that kind of Lynchian thing, but we also want it so that you can have a wiki on it, and so that, and like there's details that you can
Yeah.
track.
Well, I definitely really appreciate that. I think the thing about the game that drew me in is that it is out there narratively. There's some crazy sci-fi concepts that we're dealing with, and there's like 3 or 4 different layers of them. There's memories and cloning and aliens and disease and all of these things that are like any one of those could be the single topic of a great sci-fi narrative, but you're able to intermesh all of them. And for me, to share where I found the game's themes to be most resonant is in the exploration of culture. I think this game is very much, to me, about the way in which we, as people in whatever culture that we're in, view another culture through sort of a strange lens of the way that people talk to one another in different cultures. How is that different from our own everyday objects that we might take for granted? And I really found powerful moments when Watcher or any of the clone characters that exist in a culture totally different from ours are approaching modern day human culture, and Watcher not knowing what a goldfish was or not knowing what rain is,
Mm-hmm.
and these things that we take for
Mm-hmm.
granted, and watching them through her eyes sort of explore and Secretary describe what this is, it really like enlightened in me like how we approach culture, because simultaneously I'm watching Watcher learn about my culture, but I'm also learning
Mm.
about her culture and
Yes, yeah,
the
yeah,
ways
yeah,
that
yeah.
they have different phrases and what's the history of these things and how do they treat family and religion and government and stuff. For me, it's about culture and about the ways that different people from different cultures, whether that's time wise or physically on the planet, view each other's cultures in different ways.
Mm-hmm. 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 Nice.
I'm also curious about the gameplay variety in this game throughout different sections of the game, whether that's chapters or sections within chapters. there's different kinds of control. You have first person moments, you have side scroller moments, you have full 3D, and then you also have what I was referring to in my mind as like the boost sections where you're like zipping towards
Yeah,
different
yeah,
points.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I'm curious what the creative process was like choosing which moments to apply different gameplay structures to.
In the first 5 chapters, it was really felt out. Like, like in the second chapter, we knew that we were going to go visit Iris's childhood home and meet her family. It really made sense to us that that would be in first person because it was way more intimate. And then, of course, the design constraint for that was that the apartment got to be smaller and more realistic, and that was a desire. We were also thinking about like comparable experiences, like something like Gone Home, right? Like there's a little bit of a homage to like an indie game history now at this point, where it's like, yeah, here we go. We're going to be dealing with very intimate home environment. Let's do it in first person. The third chapter, there are many like 2.5D or 2D kind of narrative games like Detention, or more recently Until Then and A Space for the Unbound, Night in the Woods, this kind of like 2D way of telling narrative games that I think we also want to do homage, but then at the same time we were like, oh, I guess it could be a little bit more like a storybook fairy tale kind of thing. So sometimes it was out of necessity of gameplay, sometimes it was a desire to shift genre, but a lot of it was really determined around like thinking about what's the proximity of the player to the player character, right? And with first person often being the closest proximity you can have to a player character, because you're just inside that player character's head, I guess. What is the kind of utility or function artistically and formally when you can play with that distance? Say chapter 4, it's a little bit closer, but to a certain extent, the 2D side-scrolling thing is a little bit more distant, a little bit more stage-like. And what does that afford you in the way that you can tell the story? And same with all of these different things, right?
Yeah. And I don't think enough games really take advantage of that variety to sort of like lock you into different mind states or different thought processes as you're playing through the game, because your mind does work in different ways when there's a fixed camera perspective versus you're able to control it,
Yes.
or top down camera perspective. And most
Yes.
games are locked to one, so you don't really feel like you're like, oh, that's just what the game is. But you can switch between them.
We were kind of heavily inspired by Nier Automata. That does switch between different things, but then often for different types of combat modes. And then of course, that's a reduction. There's many different ways in which it's used in that game. But I think, we were doing it and we were asking ourselves, it's like, okay, if we did what that game was interested in doing, but we don't have any combat, we have to undertake a different type of logic and why we're organizing it this way, which is much about that distance and proximity and what that can afford you in storytelling technique. And then in the second half of the game, it's kind of somewhat of a repeated form in that regard, where chapter 7 is much like chapter 2, and then chapter 8 is much like chapter 3, and then chapter 9 is much like chapter 4. Then that macro structure is when it's nice. It can start to tell you what to do next.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the boldest creative decisions of this game is ostensibly having you start over halfway through. You see to the beginning player's mind is the climactic moment of the game of Watcher killing the All-Mother, and that happens like halfway through the game almost exactly, and then you pick up with a totally new character. And I fully admit that I was like really like confused by this and like alienated by it.
Yeah.
And obviously that's intentional because
Yeah.
it mirrors very nicely the beginning of the game versus when you first wake up as Blue, being dropped into a world that you know nothing about, and who are all these characters and what the hell is going on. But it's, again, as I was saying, it was a very bold creative decision to hit that restart point halfway through and have to pick up the scraps as it's going. But you've learned enough from that first half of the game that it's not as stressful to like really like, okay, I've recognized some of these characters, I remember some of the things they're referencing.
I think it becomes a little game about what can you recognize now. Yeah.
I really appreciated that, even though when I woke up as Blue in the old city, at first I was like, what the heck is going on, man? Like, I thought I was on top of this.
But that itself is like, I don't know if you've watched Adventure Time. They do that in Adventure Time when they have I think they call it the 10,000 plus timeline. Like, it just jumps far into the future, and you're just like, oh man, I kind of recognize some of these things, but they're not the same, and what's going on, and yeah, I don't know. I guess I've always been dispositioned to like really like that feeling for myself, and now I'm just want to inflict it onto others.
Well, it worked. I'm also curious about the variety of roles that you played working on 1000xRESIST. In the game's credits, I have written down you are credited as game director, game designer, lead writer, you're involved in trailer production, and also many parts of the audio process. And I'm curious how you balance your time between these roles. Did any of them come easier to you than others, or what was that like?
uh, yeah, it was hard because of course there's much of the administrative paperwork stuff too
Of
that one
course,
has to
yeah,
do.
yeah. You're the owner of a business at this point.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with the one that I enjoyed the most, and often was most re-energizing, was the voiceover recordings. Directing the voiceover recordings. I wasn't in every single one of them, but I was in a lot of the. I made sure to be in all the ones where it's like with all the main sisters, and that was nice because it was a nice break away from, say, paperwork and working on the game in Unity, right? So that was always re-energizing, but that took a lot of time. It was like brute force time. It was just like, here's 2 hours or 4 hour voice recording session, and you got to go pay attention for 4 hours straight, in a really big way, where even at the computer you can just like, sometimes your mind wanders. How did I manage my time? It's just very hard. It was just, you had to do it, I guess. I mean, how do you manage your energy? It was nice that there was some variety of things to do, but sometimes I wish, in retrospect, like I could have planned it a little bit so that there was a little bit more time I could just like kind of focus really hard on something. I don't know if I answer your question. How did I manage my time?
The
It's
answer
just,
can be it's hard. That's fine.
yeah,
That's an option.
yeah. One of the challenges in the future is trying to understand what I'm comfortable to delegate, and especially as like, as a solo artist for a long time, or a freelance artist, you're used to doing everything yourself, and so, in the future though, if the scale of work gets larger, you obviously have to delegate, and so it's just like, what is the right strategic ways to do that coming up, is always a question. So yeah.
Well, the hard introspective questions are over, and I want to end with one last element of this game's journey that I think is really fascinating, which is the critical acclaim that it's received. One of my favorite things since asking you about this, about doing this interview almost 2 months ago at this point, is watching how many stinking awards this game has been nominated for at GDC's Independent Games Festival recently, at the DICE Awards, at New York Game Awards. There's a lot of stuff. And I'm just curious, like, how's that feeling? Why have you
Yeah, I
been
mean, I will
recognized?
quickly clarify that we got the IGF nominations last year.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah, but that's only because I mentioned that because I think IGF nominations came out like yesterday, so like I don't want people to be, yeah. That being said, it feels really good. That's such a boring answer. But at the same time, I think, when you're making something, you just hate it. Right, you spend a lot of time hating it, and over time, part of being an artist, and learning to be an artist, is that understanding what those feelings inside yourself, and how to moderate what is real and what is not, right? Because you're always going to come to hate the thing that you're making, because you're just spending every waking moment making it, and also understanding that, you always know how it could be better, right? You're just not in a position to like it, that's for sure. To kind of finish it and then release it, and see some of the fan response, and then these award nominations now, it's just very surreal, and something that we're really grateful for, because we were never really considering it. Like we got nominated for the IGFs last year, but we were like, okay, well, this is probably it. And so that was already a moment of like, oh my God, we got nominated for the IGFs, and to kind of continue to get nominated for all these awards, it's just something that like, I think the biggest thing is that we're really extremely grateful, that is happening, and then that the game is kind of reaching, people in a way that they feel they want to nominate it for stuff, I guess.
And I also imagine that with all of this critical praise and the, I think, amazing fan response to it, that also comes with some pressure. It comes with some baggage of like, oh, geez, what are we going to do next time? How are people going to like it the
Yeah,
same? This is the pressures
yeah,
of being an artist.
yes, that is real. Like, the whole pressure thing is probably a new thing for us, because, before we would work just as hard, I would say, on other projects in the performing arts, but because like such a limited number of people could experience those things. There wasn't that level of felt pressure project to project. And so with this one, because of just the nature of distribution of video games and the way that they are, there's a much bigger audience in which you don't want to disappoint. And so all I can say is that generally the way that we deal with this in the arts, or the way that we're just probably you're going to see something you don't expect, but at the same time, at the heart of it, maybe something you feels familiar. I don't know. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, think that you did not disappoint with this game, and I am excited to see how your voice comes out in future projects as well. I want to thank you very much for joining me here on this dev dive. Of course, I will leave a link in the description for anyone watching this. If somehow you watched through all this and have not bought 1000xRESIST, I recommend that you go do, and I'll leave the Steam, I guess also the eShop, Switch eShop link. Again, thank you very much for joining me. Any closing thoughts before we say goodbye?
No, but it was super fun to be on a podcast to talk more about logistics. I love talking about that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
A school of fish, I believe they are referred to.
They turned their backs to each other. Strange.
A learned habit over the centuries. In this glass prison, danger can come from any direction.
Are these fish for eating?
No.
Then for what?
My best guess is entertainment.
Oh, how sophisticated.